The following scene contains sensitive images that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. In the early months of 1347, the port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula simmered under siege. Genoese merchants huddled behind thick stone walls, while outside, Mongol warriors of the Golden Horde hurled not just stones, but something far more terrifying over the battlements. Rotting corpses, limp with blackened buboes and oozing with death, crashed into the city like grim omens. The Mongols had been ravaged by a strange and merciless pestilence. Desperate to turn the tide, they turned to biological warfare. What neither they nor the Genoese could have known is that with each hurled body, they had opened a dark gate, a passage for death that would soon sweep across the known world. The Genoese fled. They boarded their ships, sailing across the Black Sea, carrying silks, spices, and a horror they didn't yet understand. Rats scurried below deck. Fleas bit into fur and skin. And so the Black Death, silent, unseen, and unstoppable, began its grim voyage westward. By October of that year, the ships docked in Messina, Sicily. What stumbled off those decks were not just merchants and sailors, but dying men. They collapsed in the streets, fevered and swollen. Within days, the city was gripped by panic. The sick showed signs never seen before. Swellings the size of apples in the groin and armpits, oozing black pus, followed by internal bleeding, vomiting, and sudden death. It moved fast, too fast. Entire households perished overnight, and the city, in horror, cast the ships back to sea, but it was already too late. The disease, later known as the Bubonic plague, had arrived in Europe. By the spring of 1348, it had carved a black crescent across Italy, slipping north through Genoa, Pisa, Florence. Venetian glassmakers stopped their fires. Roman priests shut their doors. In Florence, so many died so quickly that Boccaccio, in his Decameron, wrote of a world without funerals, bodies left in the streets, buried in mass pits by carts piled high like refuse. From Italy, it leapt across the Alps, France, Germany, Spain, England. The wind itself seemed poisoned. In Avignon, the Pope's physicians prescribed fire. They surrounded His Holiness with a ring of flames to purify the air. In London, King Edward III ordered entire streets burned and condemned the dead to be buried outside the city walls. Nothing worked. The plague came in waves, first bubonic, then pneumonic, and sometimes septicemic. One spread by flea, another by breath, the last through blood. It moved by ship, by cart, by market, and mass, and everywhere it went, it brought not just death, but collapse. By 1351, estimates suggest that as much as 50 to 60% of Europe's population had vanished. Villages were emptied, monasteries were left with no monks, fields went unplowed, markets stood silent. The very structure of medieval society began to crack. Feudal lords lost their serfs, bishops lost their congregations, and a frightened people began to question everything they had once believed. The church, long a pillar of medieval life, found its prayers unanswered. Processions of flagellants, bare-backed zealots whipping themselves in repentance, marched from town to town, calling down God's mercy. But the plague did not relent. Many turned their fury toward outsiders, Jews, lepers, and foreigners, scapegoated and massacred in frenzied pogroms from Strasbourg to Barcelona. It was a time of spiritual confusion and moral disintegration. Yet even in this abyss, change began to stir. With labor scarce, peasants suddenly held power. Wages rose, serfdom cracked. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was not just a call for better treatment. It was a cry born of a generation that had survived death and now demanded life. In cities, artisans and merchants filled the void left by vanished elites. Guilds rose in strength. Urban centers flourished. The old medieval world, rigid, hierarchical, suffused with divine order, had been dealt a mortal blow, and from its shattered remains, something new began to take shape. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, Europe stood dazed in the aftermath of the Black Death. The bells that once tolled endlessly for the dead had gone silent, but their echo lingered in the air, a reminder that the old order was gone. Fields had grown wild where entire villages once stood. Churchyards brimmed with nameless graves, and across the continent, survivors wandered a landscape both familiar and unrecognizable. Yet amid this ruin, seeds of transformation took root. In England, France, and the Low Countries, the shortage of workers gave rise to a new economic reality. Landlords, desperate for labor, offered higher wages. The feudal bond between lord and serf, already strained, began to unravel. Commoners found mobility where none had existed before. The plague, in its cruelty, had loosened the chains of medieval servitude. In Florence and Venice, where half the population had vanished, wealth concentrated in the hands of survivors. Inheritance reshaped families. Entire fortunes passed unexpectedly to distant cousins or second sons. Those who lived found themselves elevated overnight, and with newfound wealth came curiosity, ambition, and a hunger to rebuild, not merely their homes, but their understanding of the world itself. The plague had not just killed bodies, it had shattered certainties. The church's authority, once unassailable, now faced doubt. People had prayed, confessed, flagellated, and still the pestilence devoured them. In its wake came a quiet crisis of faith. Some withdrew into mysticism and visions. Others turned toward reason, medicine, and the rediscovery of ancient knowledge. Physicians who had once spoken of humors and divine punishment began to observe, to document, to search for cause and pattern. It was the beginning of a slow intellectual awakening that would, centuries later, give rise to modern science. But in the near term, the scars of the plague reshaped power itself. Monarchies, struggling to reassert control over weakened realms, leaned on bureaucracy and taxation. The church, impoverished by loss and scandal, sold indulgences and relics to fill its coffers. This corruption, born in the ashes of pestilence, would one day fuel reformation and revolt. Art, too, changed. Gone were the golden saints of early Gothic panels. In their place appeared memento mori, grim reminders of death painted on monastery walls. Skeletons danced with kings in the danse macabre. Skulls peered from books of hours. Beauty and decay intertwined, a mirror to a generation that had seen how fragile flesh could be. Yet within this fascination with death lay a deepening appreciation for life. In Florence, the Medici rose. In Bruges, merchants financed cathedrals and paintings. The Renaissance dawned not in spite of the plague, but because of it. The trauma had forced Europe to look inward, to question divine order, and to rediscover human potential. Meanwhile, the disease itself never fully vanished. It returned in cycles: 1361, 1374, 1400. Each wave smaller, but still cruel. Cities tried to prepare. Quarantine, first practiced in Ragusa in 1377, became law in Venice by 1423. The word itself, 40 giorni, 40 days, was born from these dark times. Travelers and ships were isolated before entering city gates, a desperate attempt to halt the invisible killer. Across the Mediterranean, doctors in long waxed coats and bird-like masks stalked the streets. The beak held herbs and vinegar thought to cleanse the air. Their presence became an emblem of terror and endurance alike. By the 16th century, trade had resumed, empires expanded, and Europe's population began to recover. But memory remained sharp. The Black Death had rewritten society, faith, and thought. The world that emerged from it was harder, wiser, and infinitely more ambitious. From its soil would spring the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution that would one day unmask the very microbe that had once brought a continent to its knees. Yet that revelation lay centuries away. For now, the story of the plague was not finished. In faraway ports and desert towns, the ancient pathogen still slept, waiting for ships, rats, and circumstance to wake it once more. Though the memory of the Black Death still loomed in Europe's collective soul, many had come to believe the worst had passed. But the disease had not vanished. It had merely retreated. Hidden in trade routes, lurking in the alleys of busy ports, and nestled in the black fur of rats aboard merchant ships, the plague reawakened with deadly force. This time, it struck in waves that gripped early modern Europe at the very moment it was beginning to reshape itself through science, discovery, and empire. In 1629, northern Italy fell under siege again, not from foreign armies, but from pestilence. Milan, Venice, and surrounding cities saw their populations decimated. Churches rang with funeral bells once more. Priests carried last rites from house to house, and mass graves returned. The plague spread in step with war. During the 30 Years' War, soldiers carried more than muskets. They carried contagion. Wherever armies moved, the disease followed. The cities of the Holy Roman Empire, already weakened by famine and conflict, buckled under the weight of death. Then came London. In 1665, the English capital became the epicenter of one of the most devastating urban outbreaks in modern memory. By then, the city had swelled to over 400,000 souls, tight-packed, unhygienic, and ripe for infection. The first deaths were barely noticed. A tailor in St. Giles, a handful of servants, but the numbers climbed. Within weeks, entire neighborhoods were marked with red crosses and the words, "Lord have mercy," painted on the doors. Quarantine orders were brutal. Families were sealed inside with the dead. Watchmen guarded homes like prisons. Doctors, many ignorant of the true cause, offered herbs and bloodletting. Some fled. Others died at their posts. Samuel Pepys, a clerk of the Admiralty, kept a diary. He recorded the horror with a cold, trembling eye. He wrote of the silence on the streets, the smell of death, the empty markets, and the endless tolling of the plague bell. By the time the outbreak subsided in 1666, ironically aided by the Great Fire of London, which burned much of the city's filth, the plague had killed nearly 100,000 people. But across the sea, the plague was beginning to loosen its grip. Scientific minds had begun to rise. In 1676, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch tradesman with a handmade microscope, peered into a droplet of water and saw what no human had seen before: tiny living creatures, invisible to the naked eye. Though he did not yet understand their role in disease, his discovery laid the foundation for what would become microbiology. Centuries later, that seed would flower in the mind of a man named Alexander Yersin. It was 1894. The plague had returned, this time to Hong Kong. As ships carried death across the Pacific to India and San Francisco, Yersin, a French-Swiss bacteriologist trained at the Pasteur Institute, traveled to the heart of the outbreak. There, he worked with primitive equipment in stifling heat, examining samples from swollen lymph nodes, and in that fetid tissue, he found it, the pathogen. He named it Yersinia pestis. For the first time in history, the ancient terror had a face. Yersin discovered that the disease was not caused by bad air or divine wrath, but by a microscopic bacillus carried by fleas and hosted in the bloodstream of rats. It was a revolution in understanding. The plague, once seen as a mysterious punishment from the heavens, had become a problem of nature, of vectors and hosts, of biology and ecology. Armed with this knowledge, scientists developed better containment strategies. Quarantine became medical, not just moral. Port cities created, sanitation protocols, flea eradication programs were launched, and as antibiotics emerged in the 20th century, the plague, once the horseman of the apocalypse, became treatable, survivable. Yet even now, Yersinia pestis has not disappeared. In remote regions of Madagascar, the Congo, and the American Southwest, the bacteria still live. In wild rodents, in prairie dogs, in the quiet grasslands and high deserts, outbreaks still occur. Each year, a handful of deaths remind us that the Black Death was not a chapter. It is a thread woven through history, still pulsing in the background. And what of the world it left behind? The plague did not just reshape Europe. It redefined how humanity understood its own vulnerability. It gave rise to public health. It challenged faith and ignited science. It unmade the old world and forced the birth of the modern. It taught a terrible, lasting lesson that beneath all empires and faiths and monuments, life rests upon the fragile breath of unseen things. In the centuries since the last great waves of plague receded, the shadow of the Black Death has never truly vanished. It lingers, not just in bacteria hidden in the soil or rodents scurrying through forgotten fields, but in the psyche of civilizations. In literature, law, medicine, and memory, the legacy of the Black Death continues to shape the world we know. The societies that emerged from the wreckage of the 14th century were not the same ones that had entered it. Before the plague, Europe was bound by tradition, hierarchy, and rigid belief systems. After, those bonds loosened. The trauma of mass mortality introduced a radical sense of impermanence. The living no longer took the order of the world for granted. With half the population gone, every life and every death carried new weight. This shift seeped into every corner of culture. In the wake of the plague, art turned inward. No longer merely devotional, it became human. In the frescoes of Giotto, we see emotion, grief, and tenderness. In the poetry of Petrarch, we hear longing and despair. The Renaissance, so often celebrated for its classical rediscoveries, was also born from a medieval world forced to reckon with suffering on an unimaginable scale. Without the plague, there may have been no Renaissance at all. The legal systems of Europe, too, were transformed. With entire families wiped out, property laws were rewritten, inheritance passed not through predictable lines, but through survivors. Cities and towns offered citizenship to migrants willing to settle abandoned lands. Women, often widowed and newly in possession of wealth, found themselves in positions of unexpected influence, owning businesses, property, and shaping civic life in ways previously denied to them. The church, though still powerful, would never recover the same kind of unquestioned authority it had enjoyed before the plague. Its failure to protect the faithful from the horror, combined with its willingness to scapegoat and exploit, fractured its image. This erosion of spiritual trust helped prepare the soil for the Protestant Reformation. When Luther nailed his theses to the church door in 1517, he was speaking to a Europe already haunted by memories of death and betrayal. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Black Death lies in the birth of modern medicine and public health. The idea that disease had a natural cause, that it could be tracked, studied, and prevented, grew slowly but inexorably from the ashes of medieval devastation. Quarantine zones, death registries, health boards, and port inspections all found their roots in the plague years. It was a slow shift, from superstition to observation, from punishment to pathology, but it changed the way humanity defended itself. Even language bears the scar. The word quarantine, as we've seen, was born in 14th century Venice. The phrase Black Death itself did not emerge until centuries later. But its imagery, darkness, suffocation, rot, remains a cultural shorthand for catastrophe. And in times of new pandemics, from cholera to influenza to COVID-19, echoes of the plague resurface. In fear, in policy, in collective memory. In our art, we still paint death as a figure in black. In our stories, we still whisper of pestilence. And in our hearts, we still carry the ancient fear that the air itself may one day turn against us. Yet the Black Death is not only a tale of death, it is a story of endurance. Europe did not collapse. It rebuilt. From the horror came healing. From silence came song. Great cathedrals rose again. Books were copied. Cities flourished. Trade resumed. Humanity pressed forward. Not untouched, not unscarred, but transformed. The Black Death reshaped the very foundations of the medieval world, and in doing so, carved the path toward the modern one. It was not simply a tragedy, it was a turning point, and in its terrible shadow, a new kind of light began to grow. Not divine, not eternal, but human, enduring, and alive. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more epic documentaries that explore the forgotten forces that shaped our world. And if your ancestors lived through the plague, or if you carry echoes of that time in family stories, share them in the comments. We read every one. History remembers what we choose to retell.